right, well, good morning. It is great to be here. I was here 3 years ago, and my life has changed quite a bit. When I was here 3 years ago, I was running Intel's health and life sciences business, and in many ways, I'm going to be talking about the same thing. These are slides from when I showed 3 years ago. Was particularly focused on an initiative that we had then on genomics all in one day. How can we go from sequencing to predictive or care solutions all in one day? And if you know anything about everything from the technology to the workflow of trying to do that kind of work, there's a lot of challenges and barriers, but we're certainly closer now than we were back then. And I talked a lot about behavioromics back then. How do we start to capture changes in behavior? And you heard some in the dean's presentation just a minute ago about the importance of all of those other factors of life outside of genetics, and trying to figure out how we're going to visualize this data, both for researchers, for clinicians, and for patients to try to understand that. So now I've moved to the National Institutes of Health. Everyone asked me, is it really different than Silicon Valley? I was like, well, Intel was a big company. It's just a different bureaucracy, and I don't know how to navigate this one yet, but it's an amazing opportunity. I can throw a paper airplane out of my office and building one on the NIH campus, and anybody it comes close to can teach me amazing things about biology and medicine. And in that environment, it's just an amazing thing for a technology, social scientist person to actually show up. And I'm still fundamentally wrestling with the same issues that I talked to you about 3 years ago. How do we gather, clean, share, and make sense of a wide range of data types that we can bring together that help to try to understand the complicatedness or the uniqueness of individuals? So I was thinking about my own experience, and these are some telling quotes from my own sort of multiple decades of well-intentioned imprecision medicine. And it started when I was first diagnosed with cancer when I was 19 at UNC Chapel Hill. And I remember it very clearly. These two doctors are arguing in front of me about what my definitive diagnosis is. And this is a quote: "Your definitive diagnosis is either a form of rare adult kidney cancer or a very rare form of childhood kidney tumors." I was like, well, that's not very definitive, is it? And we finally decided it was one of them. But in many ways, like the moment that definitive diagnosis showed up in my records, and so much about our record keeping is about billing and not really about health, it locked a whole series of doctors for decades to come into what that primordial original assumption of what I had was. And it really led us astray in so many ways. It became a sort of blinder or a filter by which everything else we interpreted was from that fundamental assumption. Now, very soon after there, I started a very nasty round of chemotherapy. My oncologist now that I have is a very young guy. It's like Doogie Howser. I'm like, do you need a ride home, or is your mom picking you up after you sort of check me out? But back then, he looks at my records and says, I can't believe you ever survived the things that we put you through back then. And it was, thank God, I was on this horrible chemotherapy, one of the platinum-based, very high doses compared to what we do today. I didn't weigh more than 120 pounds when it started, and I had lost 25, so I was under 100 pounds. And I met this other patient, and she was the person who taught me how to be a proactive patient, get your own data, get your own information. But she was also an actuary. I was a qualitative researcher, social scientist, but doing qualitative ethnographic research. But man, her statistics were good. And she took me to the Duke Library, and she's looking through, and she's like, Eric, they don't know anything about you. They've never seen a 19-year-old with your condition. There had been 2, maybe 3 studies on what ostensible rare kidney cancer diagnosis that I had was, and all of them were age 65 and above, and most were in their 70s and 80s. Extrapolating from the average of the people that happened to have been studied about my disease to me, and giving this 9-month life sentence that I started living out, right? When you're given a 9-month to live at age 19, it becomes manifest destiny unless you can break out of that mindset and start constructing your life to live, not die on time. So that was kind of, a big wake-up call to me that everybody's doing the best they can with the data and the science that they've got available, if they even happen to know about it. But it doesn't mean that that is truth. It does not mean that that is destiny. Now, I got this a lot. Your tumor just hasn't behaved like it was supposed to. When interferon came out, it was like that was going to be, it's like your tumor did not behave like it was supposed to. And then interleukin-2 and all these combinations there, and it was like, yeah, your tumor is just bad tumor, misbehaving, not doing the right things. And it taught me that it's like, I don't think they know as much about tumors as they actually say that they do. And I don't think the categorization of these tumors helps very much. Now, this was a good one. After 10 years of chemotherapy, and every year they'd say I'd be dead within the end of the year, I said, stop. I want you to optimize my chemotherapies based on snow time. And in the early electronic health records, I made them take the nickname field and put optimized for snow or snow dude or obsessed with snow, because I wanted them to choose chemotherapies that allowed me to continue to be in the mountains. And I was like, so which side effects I can tolerate and still be in the mountains? This was a terrible informatics problem. And they basically said, we don't know how to optimize your care based on snow time, Eric. And in fact, today, most electronic health records don't have a place for patient goals. This is nuts. This is one of the variables that needs to be calculated for in the big data analytics and the informatics that we're sort of counting for. And this was the last quote was from me at some point when I was just fed up and everybody wanted to look at my whole, and I said, I'm not giving you access to my electronic health record. New insurance, new employer, starting fresh. I was like, nope. I said, I want you to study the tumorous me that is standing in front of you right now. Because the pretense that what I had had 2 decades before, we know these things morph. My body's been filled with tons of chemicals, 57 rounds of chemo, radiation, or immunotherapy over those years. And we think things haven't changed, but yet we want to go back and look at that record. And it's like, I don't want to lock you into that thinking. And that was a big wake-up call. That was an important moment to say, look at the me that's here, that's changed in time, not the me that you've been trying to understand for all this period of time. So now, here I am. I'm just turned 50. I mean, it's a miracle that I turned 50. I was never supposed to turn 20, 30, or 40. But I'm like, what's next? Thank you. But I'm like, I had this whole genome sequence that helped us put me on a path, and we brought all my EHR together, and I got a kidney transplant 6 years ago after being cancer-free. But now I'm like, hey, what else did you learn in that whole genome sequence? It helped you guess what the mechanism of my cancer was and put me on a chemo for pancreas, even though my pancreas was fine. But it's like, what else did you learn? And now as I start to deal with some of the accumulated side effects of different chemotherapies that I was on and the transplant meds that I take now, I'm like, hey, I want to stay healthy. You've brought me back to life. I want to keep this, but I'm suffering from a lot of side effects. And man, our big data algorithms trying to understand and predict, back to the point that was made earlier, side effects are just piss poor. Like, how do we actually get to that point where we can do this? And part of the problem is we don't treat people as complex adaptive systems, but we are. And one thing that we do is look through the lens of the macroscope, right? So this is a picture of a large crowd. And yes, I'm helping to lead a very large crowd of 1 million or more people that we can try to use for research and advancement. But I'm not the average of the people who happen to share the same diagnosis codes who happen to have been studied, right? And so many of our studies have been powered too small. At the same time, when we pop on the lens of looking through a microscope, right, at a molecular level, at a cellular level, at a tissue level, am I the average of the tissues, cells, or molecules that happen to have been collected at a moment in time? We're starting to understand that the heterogeneity of different regions of a tumor is like where you took the biosample or where you took the particular pluck of tissue may have big impact on what your implications are, but it may not even be representative of the whole tumor, right? So we're not, and then all of that changes in time, right? This person is going through environmental, nutritional, stress, other kinds of things. So how does that change? So as I think about my own case, right, and looking forward, the Eric that's in this body and time that's gained 30 pounds on this NIH job, it's much more stressful than Silicon Valley. It's like, think about these different things, right? What are my risks from the 57 rounds of chemo I've been on? I've been on 371 different medications and still counting. I'm on 9 right now, post-transplant. Well, I need to get a new whole genome sequence, they tell me, because I'm post-transplant. I have another person's body part in my body, and things will have changed. The goals of snow and now garden time. My knees can't take as much snow as I used to, so now I want you to optimize for garden time. I've lived at 28 different addresses. My immune suppression goes up and down. Had a really bad year last year, and when I'm cold, turned into an infection. So I have to sort of deal with those things, and I have become oh so sedentary. I may as well pick up smoking, because it'd be healthier for me than the amount of time that I'm sitting. And I know from my own wearables that my heart rate variability is way down. I'm just not getting the variety of exercise and the variety of movement I did. So from an impatient patient perspective, when will the big data and the medicine and the understanding be pervasive enough to really shift our paradigm? We're not quite at the paradigm shift. We have lots of promising pieces, but there's still these barriers of like, what do we need to do to actually shift that paradigm? And it's a question as much as anything. Now, in my 17 years at Intel, I formed a great friendship with Andy Grove, and I miss him deeply because he was a great friend and mentor, and he was another impatient patient. We met both when we were dealing with cancer and then went through his whole Parkinson's experience together. And we mutually agreed on a number of things, the first of which was you got to own your own health and your health data like your life depends on it, because it's true, especially if you have a mortal or complicated case like we did. We mutually hated the slow pace of medical science and translation into practice by old technologies and old methods. He insisted that we understand the human condition and human needs when innovating, which is how we really got to know each other. As a social scientist who was studying the needs of doctors and nurses and home care nurses and patients in countries all around the world, it was like, wow, you're really understanding the real value propositions that are needed. And he taught me the importance of accelerating knowledge turns. I didn't even know the phrase, but it's used by economists to evaluate a nation's economic health and independence. Can a nation see societal problems, break it down into research questions, have a scientific workforce that can go understand answers to those questions and translate them into practice, whether that's medicine or whether that's astronomy or whether that's anything, right? And the degree to which they can go through that cycle on their own is one of the rating scales used to look at the viability of a country's economy. And he taught me about this, and a lot of what we would do at Intel was look at the ecosystem and say, how do we remove barriers that are going to allow the acceleration of see problem, do science, translate into practice, and make that circle go much faster? And he did infect me with an obsession for objective-driven work. So believe me, I am bringing managing by objectives to NIH, and it's very alien to them, but man, they've taken it quite well. And he also offered me hope in times of medical hell and vice versa. This is what we most did for each other. And wow, I haven't thought about him a lot until I put this deck together until recently, but hope is the heart of innovation. I absolutely firmly believe that. It's like at the core of innovation is a hope that it's like, wait a minute, that's not right. We can actually do something about it. I hope that I can do that. I believe that I can do that. And man, he brought that hope to me a lot of times. So I'm trying to bring Intelism and Andy Grovism and sort of, those kinds of thinking to NIH. I am very alone there, but it's been a great environment to actually be in. So let me just say, as a user-centered design person, if I think about the challenge of bringing precision health, and I'm so thankful that that's the name that I begged the Obama administration to change it from the Precision Medicine Initiative to the Precision Health Initiative, but I lost that battle. It was already sort of down the road. But if you think about it from the standpoint of people and patients, the vast majority of us are still not getting precision care. Now, this is not a critique of doctors. I think, by and large, everywhere that you go, physicians and nurses and practitioners are doing the best they can with limited time, limited data, and limited science to customize for the patient that's right in front of them. But in terms of really giving them the tools and the evidence and the ability to even keep up with the science, that's the system's failure at this point. So most patients are not doing this. We're still going through and we're still being treated as the average of the patients that happen to have been studied. If you have a complex case, you're going to go through trial and error like I did, and it was a whole lot of error that was difficult to survive. It can take you can take years to unravel what your complicated health conditions are. And then, many cases, patients still don't have access to their own data even when they actually want it. If you look at it from the standpoint of providers who are being forced by economic paradigms, at least in this country, into kind of a factory line of 15-minute frisking of the person that happens to be standing in front of them, what a crappy environment. I've been watching Pew surveys where physicians increasingly over the last 2 decades in particular are not recommending to their children that they go into the field anymore, and that's a radical change. I mean, it's a terrible time in some sense to try to live your Hippocratic Oath and do the best that you can for those patients. So they don't have the tools, they don't have the outside of progress and cancer and a few other places. It's not like we're giving them predictive, preventive options that often, and the reward systems don't actually reward them for that for the most part. And if you think about it from biomedical researchers, right before I left Intel, we were studying biomedical researchers and clinical oncologists and other places where precision medicine was happening in multiple countries. And across these countries, we would literally see a scientist get a 5-year award and spend 3 of those 5 years just trying to figure out their big data technology to deal with the data, another year just trying to set up to recruit their study, and they weren't even getting to the science until the 4th or 5th year of their award. And we saw this over and over in country after country. And it's like, how do we get those scientists to be able to get to the work much more quickly? These are the kinds of user needs that we're trying to enable with the All of Us research program. So what's our mission? You'll see that Andy Grove influence on me right here. Our mission is to accelerate health research and medical breakthroughs, enabling individualized prevention, there's that word again, treatment and care for all of us. So many people think of precision medicine as genomics, and we're like, nope, it's an important tool of the tool belt, but it's not a genomic study. And so many people think of it as this is just better pharmacogenetics, right, or better drugs. And it's like, yes, this will help generate better drugs, but it's about much more than that. It's about whole person health. To do that, our 3 strategic objectives that guide the organization and the consortium. First, if we're going to succeed, we have to nurture relationships with 1 million or more people who are participant partners in our effort from all walks of life for decades. I'll talk about the importance of the diversity that we're aiming for in this 1 million-person cohort in a minute. If we do that, then we will deliver what we believe to be, if not the largest, certainly one of the largest, richest biomedical public resources ever, and we want to make it as easy and safe and free for people to use as we possibly can. But even if we build it, will they come? We've got to catalyze a robust ecosystem of researchers and funders who are hungry to influence and use this resource for decades to come. It's like the Framingham Heart Study, except it's the whole country and a lot more diversity of people. And it's not just heart health that we're actually focused on. And we've got to make sure that we're, in particular, reaching out to improve the brain power per problem. I don't want just the tier 1 places that probably could afford to do a 1 million-person study if they brought their resources together to get to play in the sandbox. How do citizen scientists, how do community colleges, how do more get to use this resource to drive science and understanding? People ask me, why do we need it? I'm like, look, as a taxpayer, I will be the first one to say, let's stop the All of Us research program if another 1 million-person or larger cohort is going to pop up and say, yep, we're going to focus on the diversity of people that you are. We're going to get the diversity of data that you're going to get. We're going to be participant-centered and give the data back to participants that they want it and make it an open resource for all researchers at the same time. If somebody else will do that, I would be like, hey, let's use this money for something else. There is no evidence that's happening anywhere else in the world. And the moment that somebody says they'll commit to go to those things, I'll be like, great. Or we'll do 2 million. We'll do 1 million, and you'll do 1 million, and the public resource will be even larger. So these are just some of the kinds of data sets that we want to pull together. I'm not going to go through the whole list, but again, we're trying to triangulate multiple kinds of data sets from environmental, social, biological, behavioral, and we can't do it all at once. Our first protocol doesn't begin to capture all of these data sets, but like a product release, I hope I can get people excited about, hey, Protocol 2 release of the All of Us program is going to now add these features and capabilities and start to pull in this kind of data. Protocol 3 will do this, and hopefully get people excited about those different releases. The basic version 1 protocol that some of you in the room might have done already, you can go to joinallofus.org and join, is an enrollment and consent process where you are authorized to share your electronic health record. We've tried to make that, some of the people who get really frustrated, they're like, well, it's a lot of videos that you have to go through and read. We are pushing for a level of informativeness down to 5th grade reading level. So, you know, if you're well above that reading level, you might get impatient with these videos that are trying to walk you through carefully, but we are trying to get people to truly understand what they're signing up for. We need them to be with us for decades, so no surprises to the degree that we can do that. Answer a few surveys, initially kind of the basics, overall health and personal habits. There's 2 more that are coming out now that have just been translated into Spanish. A lot of these are instruments that we've taken from NIH and other folks. We're not inventing our own, but we do find that we have to push the reading level lower. So we'll have to translate down to 5th grade reading level, go test those instruments and make sure that they're still collecting things, translate it into Spanish, get the IRB to approve it, and then release those. So there's one on healthcare utilization and access, as well as family history that's coming, that people are starting to do now. You may be invited to do physical measurements and provide biospecimens. The criteria for that are demographically, geographically, and health status-wise, we want a diversity of people, focusing especially on those who are underrepresented in biomedical research. Science has left behind so many races and ethnicities in the country that we live in, older and younger people, people in non-urban areas, that we want 70 to 75% of this 1 million people to be those who are underrepresented in biomedical research. And in our beta phase, before we launched nationally, we had about 44,000 people somewhere in the process, about 27,000 of them. We were sitting at right about the 70 to 75% range for those underrepresented in biomedical research. Now that we're open nationally, we'll see where those numbers go. But by the time we get to the end, and we think it'll take us about 5 or 6 years, that's the goal, is to have this be an incredibly diverse thing. So you may be invited to come do physical measurements, height, weight, blood pressure, you can see those there, provide some biosamples, and then we're starting now with a BYOD, bring your own device phase of wearables, where if people have a Fitbit, we're doing Fitbit first, but we'll be working with all the vendors, you can actually start to share your data. I don't know yet what we're going to do. We can talk about it in the discussion in terms of, are we going to try to get one wearable that all million people have? But that'll be some years out. You can read about the whole protocol on allofus.nih.gov, but that's the basics right now. We're piloting now some richer ways to capture EHR. People ask me if genomics will be the most expensive thing. I was like, well, I can't tell yet. But I have to say whole genome sequencing is still pretty expensive. We are planning on those million invited to do those biospecimens, genotyping and whole genome sequencing of all of them. In fact, if you are a large genome center, the call for funding announcement went out today. So if you go to the All of Us website or the allofus.nih.gov, you can actually see that the funding announcement came out today. We want you to be prepared to ramp up to do 100 to 200,000 genotypes per year and at least 100,000 whole genome sequences per year by the time we hit 2020 or in late 2019. We're doing some pilots on wearables, and then we need to pilot the return of genetic information. Even our health provider organizations who have genetic counseling don't have enough capacity to deal with the additional folks joining our research study. If we're going to give data back to people, which is part of the fundamental value, then we've got to figure out the legitimate and right way of doing that, but there are limits. We're a research study, we're not their care provider. So this is particularly challenging for people that are coming in either without insurance, without a health provider, or not associated with any of the health providers in our network. This is the basic structure of the program. On the foundation here, you see these 3 networks of partners that cover the country. What we call participant or direct volunteer network. In fact, I'll just show you some of the logos. You can see the folks here, folks like Walgreens, WebMD. EMSI does in-home physicals for almost every insurance company and can reach where about 95% of everybody in the country lives for an in-home visit. Now, we can't afford an in-home visit for every single person for $1 million, but we want to make sure those who are too frail or live in an area that's not safe, with those direct volunteer partners, we have the capacity to do high-quality capture of biospecimens and samples and do the physical measurements. We just can't afford to light up all of that capacity at one time. So as we continue to add sites around the country, we'll also just be doing pop-up capacity. Oh, look, this is a great community in a region of the country that hasn't been studied. Many people have signed up and already done their EHR authorization and their surveys. We'll come to town for 6 to 12 months, do pop-up capacity, and then wait, and we'll come back to town when we do Protocol 2, Protocol 3, and so forth. The other pieces of this are a network of health provider organizations. These range from small federally qualified health centers who are really key to our diversity strategy to large players like the Veterans Administration and all points in between. And then finally, a network of community and communications partners. Right now, every single site has to have a local participant advisory board, and every site has somewhere between 3 and 10 community partners helping to engage especially diverse communities. But at the same time, we have 26, well, actually closer to 40 national partnerships that can reach almost every county in the country, focused on getting the word out to different groups that are out there. The Data and Research Center Award went to Verily, the Broad Institute, and Vanderbilt. I can talk some about the research infrastructure and discussions. We're not ready yet. We won't open the research portal until the first half of 2019, but it's being developed now, and data is starting to be cleaned and curated and all of that. The biobank, obviously, is a huge effort. That's at the Mayo Clinic. The challenge for us, particularly because we're opening on nights and weekends to help get people who could not come into a study during the week, getting those West Coast samples in flights back to the Mayo Clinic within 24 hours is proving a challenge, especially on Sundays, but that's what we're striving for as we build our national capacity. And then the participant technology systems is building out all of the consumer-facing things that we have. So you can see the network of partners here and some of the community partners. And what I would just end with here is we launched nationally on May 6th. We did a beta phase for a year before that with tens of thousands of people help improve the systems. If you're 18 and older right now, we'll talk about children probably in the Q&A, you can sign up at joinallofus.org, and I hope you'll look at it. I hope you'll give it careful consideration. And more importantly, as we start to build out the research platforms, I'm excited to get alpha and beta feedback from people as we start to open those up and figure out how do we truly make an unprecedented public resource that can accelerate research, because you don't have to go set up your own cohort. You can come and apply to do an ancillary study on top of ours with much richer data as your starting point than what you would have to do on your own. That's the design, and pretty excited about this barrier-removing, hopefully, effort to accelerate precision health for all of us that many of you in this room are so important to help move forward. So thanks for that.
Join me for the discussion?
Sure.
So I'm going to kick off the discussion with a question, not
grab my water over
surprisingly,
here,
about
sorry.
maternal and child health.
Okay.
And so when this initiative was first announced, many of us in maternal and child health harkened back to the National Children's Study. So as many of you may know, this was an act passed by Congress in 2000, launched in 2009, and then they pulled the plug in 2014. The NIH director did. At that point, they'd already spent $1.2 billion. The National Children's Study was intended to enroll 100,000 children, follow them from pregnancy through adulthood. And so my question for you today, and this harkens, also looking back at the Institute of Medicine report that was chaired by our own doctors Altman and Pizzo, there was a very lengthy section on lessons learned. So my question for you is, how has your group tried to benefit from that work and the lessons learned?
Sure. Well, so one of the lessons learned was to be careful and iterative in your testing. So I did not know I was going to end up doing this job. I was on the advisory panel originally before it was ever sort of set up. And one of the first things that they did is actually have some of the original researchers and those who helped close down the program come teach us about, we certainly read the IOM report about what had happened. One of the things that was very clear, and this is where I think bringing some Silicon Valley thinking about a design process that looks at what our requirements are, they tried to do too many things at once. And so you can already see just in what I described that it's like, look, we have a minimum viable product now of a version 1. Is it perfect? No. Are there lots of other things we want to add to it? Yes. But we're going to add to it in an iteratively tested and requirements-driven way. We held a workshop, I don't even know what month it is anymore after lunch. It's May, so this was all the way back in April. It feels like it was years ago, where we're literally having people generate requirements. So basically it goes like this. I mean, you are, in your case, focused on childhood research. Imagine our whole 1 million-person cohort program was just to accelerate the science in your area. Which research questions would this resource be the best tool to answer? Okay, what kinds of studies would need to be done? All right, what kinds of data would you need to do that? Okay, what kinds of mechanisms, very specifically, would you need to capture that data to be able to accelerate your breakthroughs? And we're doing that in all these different fields, and then just looking for common ingredients. And what we're going to fund with our budget, because we don't have the funding to do the science, just to create the resources, ingredients, if you will, that will have multiple field impact, and then do that in a very carefully, iteratively tested way. So, some of the press would hammer us about, like, why aren't you launching immediately? And it's like, because I don't know how to launch if you don't do an alpha test and then a beta test and make sure the data is reliable, that the users can do it, that the frontline staff can manage the amount of time that it's taking to come through the process. So I think that was one of the big things that everybody said, look, you need to do. We are planning to do children. We published a report of our advisory panel working group, and now there's a consortium working group that are taking that report. And we plan to launch probably summer of 2019. And we're just trying to be really careful. In fact, their first recommendation to us internally was like, hey, we're going to focus on 0 to 6 first. It's not that we're not working on the others, but it's like, bite off a chunk that you can chew, thoroughly think it through, vet it, test it in small phases before you scale up. And I think we'll be able to manage both expectations and manage that invention process in a way that won't get us out over our skis. And obviously, we are focused on recruiting first and foremost, and that was one of the big challenges. And so I think this network of community partners was strongly influenced by, okay, all healthcare is local, so all healthcare research may be local as well. How do we create Framingham-type localness across the entire country? And that network, I think, is really key to our recruitment.
Yeah, thank you. And I really encourage people to take a look at the task force report on how to include children. It's really an outstanding document, and we've been circulating it among our maternal and child health investigators as well as people interested in life course research to try to think about how we can be involved. So I'm hoping that we'll start having some people at the microphones who want to ask questions. Oh, here we go.
You did not have enough coffee this morning.
No.
We just pass it around.
But we could talk about maternal and child health for the
she's
whole
well
thing.
equipped.
Yeah, good.
Thank you. That was fascinating. My name is Sumana. I am a clinical researcher. I also participate in clinical trials. And I was fascinated with the idea of giving the information back to the participants. As both a participant and a researcher, that is my biggest challenge. Can you elaborate a little bit on how and when you intend to give this information back to participants?
Sure. So, I mean, it was one of the fundamental and controversial values from the beginning, though certainly patient and patient advisory groups and advocacy groups were really pressing hard on it. And as a patient advocate myself, I was really pushing for it. I mean, I've been part of 13 clinical trials and studies, and it all went into a black hole. I never got a single thing back from it. So right now, it's very crude. It's like, you fill out your surveys, you can have your survey data back. Not all that helpful. Soon we'll be able to at least be able to have enough people in the cohort that you can start to see how your answers compare to others. On the EHR front, so I predict that ultimately we'll look back in time at our costs and say the genetics was not more expensive. Getting a rich longitudinal health record for each of our 1 million people that was helpful to both them and researchers will be our biggest expense. So I don't want NIH to stand for not invented here. So we'll be looking for tools that already exist, that where people have taken EHR data and visualized it in ways that are useful for participants. So start providing their EHR data back to them in that way. For the genetic data, one of the reasons we're going to do this 20,000 person responsible return of information pilots is, before we scale it up nationally, is no one's really done this quite at this scale. We're going to have participants who come in with no relationship to a doctor. 1% to 2% of our 1 million people, at least in today's ACMG 59 list, are going to have a known pathogenic variant. What are the ethics and the responsibilities of returning that information to an individual, and how do you do it, and particularly where there's absolutely no medical support for them? So we're going to go pilot those things as we go through. But our participants have told us, they've been part from the beginning, and they're part of our governance, and they're part of all the things that we do. They have to have preferences. There are many that want their raw data and know what to do with it, and they want to go on the internet and use other tools to actually look at their own genetic information. There are many others, even within the cohort that we have so far, that I think as today was in the sort of 65,000 range, who are like, I don't want to know, and I don't want that information. So we've got to set things up in a way where it's participant choice, but we're also trying to think really carefully about the ethics and the practicality of this when it's somebody who's incredibly vulnerable and has no help on the ground whatsoever.
Okay. We have a question over here.
Hello, I'm Samantha, a product manager at the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative. And this sounds like a really exciting initiative that you're working on. My question is, patients and patients groups often know a lot about their disease and can help drive some of the research questions. How are you thinking about incorporating patients' feedback into the research agenda for the All of Us initiative?
Sure. So we do it in multiple ways, not the least of which is having participants on the scientific committees that we have. At that workshop that I talked about, that we did requirements gathering, that was a mix of participants and patients, patient advocacy groups, top scientists in their field from NIH and people that they actually fund, as well as other funders. Because again, I got to build a resource, but make sure that others who are funding, certainly NIH institutes and centers, but also other funders, it's useful enough to them that they want to fund science on top of it. So we've had participants engage from the beginning, and that's just been part of the essence of the culture that we have. I think one of the challenges that we have right now, I ran out of time, so I didn't get to show you sort of the 3 tiers of data access that we're planning on. One of the challenges that we have, particularly for sharing information, because this is a public resource that is riskier for re-identification, like a whole genome sequence or really specific geographic information to run a geographic analysis, that's in our 3rd most controlled tier. And right now, we don't have a good way to allow citizen scientists to have access, because you need to have some credentialing and some weight behind you so that if you're a bad actor, we can hold you accountable. You know, it's relatively easy for an academic to go get a RA, whatever they call the Commons account, right? But how do you get some institutional backing behind citizen scientists? And I went out and talked to a lot of the other citizen science groups, and they're like, gosh, we don't really have a way to solve that yet either. So there's still some challenges of like, how do we truly open it up to all kinds of researchers, especially when it's riskier data for re-identification. But on the requirement side, I feel quite good about getting those requirements from the participants that are involved in our program from the beginning.
Thank you. A question over here.
Hi, Jonathan Hare from WebShield and EP3 Foundation. And I'm really glad you brought up, first of all, Andy Grove was a hero of mine. I got into this by taking his first class at Stanford Business School on strategy, and I've never given up. So
Yep.
I'm glad to have that.
It sticks with you.
It really does. And I was glad you brought up the National Children's Study, because I spent a bunch of time with those guys a few years back. And I loved it because it was like, it took on the challenge that had to be met. On the other hand, you know, the question to them was, how are you going to do consent and privacy? So you have basically a 20-year longitudinal study from in utero all the way into basically college, and you don't know where these kids are going to go. How are you going to be able to link all these data sets together? How are you going to get consent to this data that's highly proprietary, regulated data from schools like all over the place?
Yep.
And they didn't even have a group to attempt to solve that problem
Yep.
at all. It's like, how do you even think this is going to work? So with All of Me, do you guys have a solution to that problem? Or would you
All of Me was a great movie with Lily Tomlin, but it's All of Us.
All of us.
All of Me. That was a great movie if you haven't seen it. Go rent it tonight on Netflix. This is partly why, and particularly the recruitment of children is taking us longer to figure out, both the ethics but also the practicalities of how you go about doing that. And I think you're right. I mean, we have at least, in the proposals that came from our partners, they had to at least show us a plausible path to go solve all these problems before they got their funding. In the case of the health provider organizations, in particular with EHR, they had to do a data sprint as part of their application process to show us that they could package EHR data in an OMOP standard and actually send it to us, right? One of our challenges of adding more federally qualified health centers is a lot of them just don't have that know-how and that infrastructure. So we're trying to figure out how to get them funding to go do that. So I think in our case, we at least have scaffoldings of plans with qualified organizations that know how to go do that. But we also have to admit, I mean, everybody asks me, when will the science come out of this? And it's like, look, it takes years to drive major medical breakthroughs. But I think some of our first wins are going to be things about how did you recruit diverse, vulnerable, and especially skeptical communities at scale? And we're learning things about consent like every day because we keep adjusting our consent process based on the feedback from folks that are in there. One of those reasons that there's so many videos involved in our consent process was because as we were reaching out to particularly distrustful and vulnerable populations who have earned that distrust because we did horrible things to African American communities in the days of Tuskegee and numerous others. I mean, that's that kind of learning. We're so busy driving this that we stop to forget. And all these people are saying, you guys need to just start keeping a public journal of the decisions that they're making and the things that you're learning, because that would be valuable information in of itself. I think I'm going to hire an anthropology team just to study what we're doing so there's a documentation of it as we go through.
But there's another underlying issue. Like, I don't know if you're familiar with Chimes, did the National Patient ID matching
Oh,
challenge.
yes. In my Intel life, I was very involved in that world.
Exactly. I think it was 700 applicants in 2 years, and they came back, we got nothing. You can't agree when you're, this consent form, I don't know if it's the same person as from this school record, this genome, that claim. So if you can't solve that, it doesn't really matter what your consent form is.
Yep.
I don't know who this is.
And this is one of the reasons, I mean, one of the fundamental strategies back when the working group was evaluating is the All of Us program, or at that point the PMI cohort program, going to be a cohort of cohorts, or are we going to start fresh? And one of the reasons that we came to the conclusion that we needed to start fresh was the difficulties of jurisdictional rules and issues and trying to get reconsent of all these original cohorts and the ownership from all these different folks who are being very turfy about it. Was just going to be a much more difficult path than starting on our own. And I don't pretend that we have all these problems solved, but at least we can contain it and control it within the world that we're doing. What makes me a little nervous is people are starting to look at what we're doing saying, hey, you're going to be setting a de facto standard. I'm like, let us get through a few more iterations before you start copying what we're doing, right? Because we're going to fail at some of these attempts, and we need to be able to recover from those failures and keep moving forward. So I don't think we have all of this problem solved, but we're certainly aware of them. And we're also just reaching out to experts globally. There's a great large cohort meeting at Duke. That was also in April, which seems like years ago. Learning very best practices from the others. And there's a bunch of these common problems. I didn't get to my list of big challenges because I ran out of time, but one of the ones that we're having is who's got the best algorithms and who's at the forefront of doing de-identification of data, and especially once you start having laminations of data that in their collectiveness create more risk of re-identification as opposed to just each thinking about each data type and by itself.
So I'm afraid we only have a few minutes left. Maybe we can get in one or two more questions, and then the beauty of this day is there'll be lots of opportunities for further discussion.
Okay, wonderful talk, thank you.
Thank you.
You mentioned the VA, the Department of Veterans Affairs, and I wanted to ask a little bit more about that. So I'm sure you know the VA has the Million Veterans Program and has been very successful, and enrollment is now up, I think, above 600,000.
Yep, 623 or something like that.
Yeah, very, very big, and has put a lot of work into not only the genomic side, but also the phenotyping using the very extensive electronic health record data available and recognizing the complications and the need for natural language processing or other information extraction techniques, and a lot of work on that and recognition of work that further needs to be done. Mm-hmm. Now, I know it's a very circumscribed group and a circumscribed EHR, but I wonder, they also had a big de-identification project. I'm not sure where that ended up. So I wonder if you could say a little more about the ways in which you're working with that large group.
Oh, for sure. Well, first of all, they're one of our HPOs. We fund them to recruit from the Million Veterans Program. In fact, VA Palo Alto is one of their first beta sites that's now scaling up. Mike Gaziano and I have been joined like this, as has the UK Biobank, because we were all on the original working group together. Chris O'Donnell is on our executive committee from the VA and from the MVP program. So they've been sharing just enormous amounts of very practical hints to us. And of course, now as two federal agencies with these two large cohorts, we're looking at everything from like, how do we start to do analysis across those, but also as we sort of go forward in time, they're trying to open up to military families beyond just veterans themselves, which would really increase the diversity of who they can actually bring in for our program as well. So we are we're just sort of daily connected with them, and they're certainly our brethren in this. And Mike and I both think of a sort of responsibility as these two sort of anchor tenant government-funded million-person programs that it's our responsibility to turn it into 2 million or more and actually create as much seamlessness across those. Now, our data is going to be more open than theirs currently is, and they need to sort of keep the pressure on them to say, look, you need to open up your data to all researchers. But we get to learn from them greatly, as we do from the UK Biobank.
I think we maybe have time for one more question. Oops.
Thank you. My name is Chi Liu. I'm from the FDA. Great talk. Thank you, Eric.
Sure.
I have a question regarding whether in your program you're going to capture the information on medicines the patients are taken, and also their clinical outcome, including efficacy and safety. And also you're going to include medical imaging data as well.
So I think we'll do all of those, but in time, especially the medical imaging. So we have a set of initial things that we're pulling from the EHR data. Imaging, the existing imaging is either in the second or third round that will actually start into early 2019, if I can remember the roadmap well. In terms of doing whole new imaging for folks, it's certainly something that we dream to. Right now, I got to focus on the cost of whole genome sequencing and genotyping for 1 million people, as well as getting rich EHR data for 1 million people. But I certainly think that imaging is going to be one of the possibilities that we want to do going forward. We are focused, we are pulling in, and there's a module that's going to come out soon on medications that's a lot more in depth than what we get in the basic module right now. So that's definitely coming as well.
All right, Eric, thank you for your presentation. Thank you to everyone for the great discussion.
Thank you for having me. It was good to be back.